They tell you survival is instinct, a reflex burned into flesh, older than language, older than law. They tell you even animals understand it, that when the blade comes down, you flinch. When the void opens beneath your feet, you grasp for an edge. When death breathes close enough to fog your visor, you fight, not for honor, not for doctrine, but simply to remain. That is the first lie the Imperium teaches you without ever speaking it aloud. Because in the 41st millennium, survival is not innocence, it is evidence. I learned this lesson on a world whose name has already been scrubbed from the archives, as if erasure could absolve what was done there. A manufacturing planet, one of 1,000,000, wrapped in perpetual smog and prayer chants broadcast through rusted Vox towers. Its skies were the color of old bruises. Its ground vibrated constantly, not from bombardment, but from labor. Billions of lives spent each day producing shells, armor plates, ration bars stamped with the Aquila. Lives so cheap that even their deaths were expected to maintain output quotas. I was one of the few who lived when the sky finally broke. They called it a compliance failure. The administratum loves terms that flatten reality into something manageable, something clean. In truth, the planet missed its tide by a fraction so small, it would have gone unnoticed on any sane world. But sanity is not a recognized currency in the Imperium. Only obedience is, and obedience, once questioned, must be answered with fire. The fleet arrived without ceremony. No ultimatum, no chance for repentance. The first shells fell while the morning work bell was still ringing, cutting the sound in half mid-note. I remember that detail because it mattered to me then, and still does now. Because it proves we were not warned. Because it proves we were never meant to survive. I did. I survived the opening barrage by accident, not courage. A conveyor jammed on line 7, forcing me into a maintenance trench moments before the ceiling collapsed. I survived the next 3 days by crawling through service ducts filled with ash and melted flesh, drinking condensation from pipes that carried chemical runoff instead of water. I survived because the dead were thicker than the living, and their bodies absorbed shrapnel meant for me. Each breath I took was stolen from someone else. By the 4th day, the bombardment stopped. Not because mercy had been found, but because there was nothing left worth shelling. That was when the ground troops came. That was when survival stopped being passive and became active defiance. The Imperial Guard moved through the ruins in disciplined lines, flamers sweeping left and right, lasguns set to burn rather than pierce. They were not there to fight an enemy. They were there to erase evidence. Any heat signature was investigated. Any movement was answered with fire. I watched them from beneath a collapsed hab block, my body pressed into a hollow carved by an impact crater. A woman ran from cover 20 meters away, her hands raised, her mouth forming words I could not hear through the ringing in my ears. She made it 3 steps before her torso simply ceased to exist. The guardsman who fired did not slow, did not look back. His squad stepped over what remained of her without breaking formation. That was the moment I understood. The crime was not rebellion. The crime was endurance. I stayed hidden for another day, listening to the crackle of flames and the methodical advance of boots. When they finally found me, it was not because I made noise or moved too quickly. It was because I coughed. A single reflexive spasm as ash clogged my lungs. That sound echoed louder in my mind than any artillery strike. They dragged me into the open, stripped me of the scrap metal blade I had fashioned from debris, bound my hands, pushed me to my knees among dozens of others pulled from the ruins. We were thin, burned, hollow-eyed, but alive. That was enough. An officer walked the line, his coat pristine, his boots untouched by soot. He did not ask our names. He did not ask where we had been when the tithe failed. He simply counted us. When he reached the end, he nodded once. Unaccounted population, he said. Surplus. The word landed heavier than any sentence. They shot every 3rd person where they knelt, to save ammo. The rest of us were loaded into transports and shipped off-world under guard. No charges were read, no trial convened. We were listed as potential insurgents, statistically likely to harbor sedition due to prolonged, unsupervised survival. Survival had made us suspicious. Continued survival made us guilty. I learned later in a holding facility whose walls were etched with prayers scratched by fingernails that the Imperium does not fear rebellion nearly as much as it fears precedent. A world allowed to endure punishment and still produce survivors is a dangerous thing. It suggests that humanity can persist without absolute control, that people can live without permission. That idea is heresy. They gave us a choice eventually, or something shaped like one: penal legion service or summary execution. Fight where you are sent, until you die in a way that benefits the Emperor, or die immediately in a way that does not inconvenience anyone. I chose to fight, not because I believed, not because I wanted redemption, but because some broken animal fragment of me still clung to breath. That fragment would be punished for its defiance many times over. War followed war, names blurred together, trenches, hive streets, frozen plains littered with the remains of armies that had been promised glory and delivered meat. I watched men executed for retreating from positions already overrun. I watched officers shot by commissars for hesitating to send their troops into artillery fire that had not yet lifted. I watched entire companies purged because someone somewhere survived an engagement they were statistically expected to lose. Each time the lesson was reinforced: if you survive where you should have died, you have disrupted the Emperor's accounting. Eventually I stopped telling myself I was unlucky. I stopped believing I was an exception. I began to understand that survival itself was reshaping me, carving away anything that might still be called human. Fear became calculation. Hope became a liability. Mercy became a weakness others could exploit to justify your execution. By the time they selected me for further service, I no longer remembered when I had last slept without dreaming of firing squads. They always do. They told me my endurance marked me as worthy of something greater, that my refusal to die, tested and refined through endless slaughter, had caught the attention of powers far above my understanding. They stripped me of my name, my past, my right to remember the world that had burned. They gave me armor, heavy, black, unforgiving. They told me survival was no longer enough. Now survival had to be sanctified, weaponized, directed outward. I believed them, for a time. But even as ceramite closed around my body, even as litanies replaced my thoughts, a truth lingered beneath the conditioning, stubborn as scar tissue. A truth learned in ash and blood, long before faith had teeth. The Imperium does not reward those who live. It tolerates them, temporarily. And every breath you take beyond what was decreed for you is another count added to a ledger that will, eventually, be balanced. I know this now with absolute certainty, because I am still alive, and one day, that will be the greatest crime of all. They taught me that survival could be purified, that if you wrapped it in ritual, in obedience, in the correct words spoken at the correct pitch, it would cease to be a flaw and become a virtue. They said endurance, when yoked to faith, was no longer defiance, but devotion. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe it. Because if they were wrong, then everything I had done to remain breathing was not only meaningless, but damning. The armor erased pain first. That was the mercy. The second thing it erased was hesitation. The machine spirits responded faster than thought, moving limbs before doubt could form. By the time my mind registered what I was doing, the action had already been completed in the Emperor's name, clutching a book whose pages had been hollowed out to conceal dried ration strips. He did not run. He did not scream. He simply looked at me as if I were a natural disaster given form. I hesitated, not long, a fraction of a second, less time than it takes to draw breath, but it was enough. The targeting reticle flickered. The armor recorded the delay. Another warrior ended it for me. A bolt round reduced the child in the book to red mist and drifting paper. The machine spirits approved. The delay was logged, flagged, reviewed later in silence. After the world was cleansed, we gathered in orbit, while the surface burned. The shrine's great spires collapsed inward, swallowed by fire that glowed like molten gold through the smoke. A chaplain spoke of necessary sacrifice, of how survival without sanction leads inevitably to corruption, of how mercy, untempered by doctrine, is merely cowardice wearing a kinder face. I listened, I nodded, I said the words, but something had lodged itself inside me during that hesitation. A splinter of awareness. Not guilt. Guilt is still a luxury, still implies choice. This was something colder. The understanding that survival, when it persists beyond its allotted span, demands interest. The Imperium collects that interest in blood. From that point onward, I was watched more closely. Not openly, not with threats or reprimands. The most effective scrutiny in the Imperium is quiet, data reviewed, combat logs analyzed, microsecond delays measured and cross-referenced. Faithfulness reduced to numbers. I learned to be faster. I learned to be thorough. I learned to silence the part of me that remembered a world where coughing in the rubble could get you killed for living too long. And yet, no matter how efficient I became, no matter how completely I surrendered myself to purpose, I kept surviving. Missions that erased entire squads left me standing alone amid cooling corpses. Boarding actions that should have ended in decompression and death somehow deposited me back in the hangar. Armor cracked, systems failing, heart still beating. Each survival was praised publicly. Each one tightened the invisible cord around my throat. I began to understand the true nature of faith as the Imperium practices it. Faith is not belief in salvation. It is belief that your death will be correctly timed. That when the Emperor finally takes you, it will be in a way that justifies all the resources spent keeping you alive until that moment. To live too long is to suggest inefficiency. I saw it happen to others. Veterans reassigned to impossible fronts. Heroes granted honor guards and then sent to hold positions that did not exist on tactical maps. Survivors of too many wars quietly removed, their names preserved while their bodies were expended. The Imperium does not forgive endurance. It recycles it until it breaks. I began to wonder when my turn would come, not with fear but with a kind of administrative dread, as if my continued existence were a clerical error waiting to be corrected. I stopped counting victories. I stopped marking time. I measured my life in deployments survived beyond expectation. And still the armor carried me forward. Still the blade found its mark. Still I lived. That was when I realized the most dangerous thing in the Imperium is not rebellion or heresy or even corruption. It is a man who has learned how to survive everything he was never meant to. Because eventually someone will notice. And when they do, they will not ask why you lived. They will ask why you have not yet paid for it. By the time they decided I was a problem, they had already turned me into a solution too valuable to discard quickly. That is how the Imperium handles its contradictions. It buries them beneath layers of necessity until the shape of the original question can no longer be discerned. I was assigned to wars that were not meant to be won. They did not say this outright. They never do. But you learn to read between the lines of a deployment order. You notice when reinforcement timetables are conspicuously absent, when extraction windows are theoretical rather than scheduled, when the strategium projections assume casualty rates that leave no room for names, only percentages. These were the fronts where survival ceased to be unlikely and became offensive. On one such world, a mining colony hollowed into a dead moon, we were sent to delay an enemy advance. Delay is a word that pretends time exists in neat, measurable blocks. In reality, delay means stand in the path of annihilation and hope your bodies buy someone else enough seconds to matter. The enemy there were not Xenos, nor traitor Astartes, nor anything grand enough to earn songs. They were workers, men and women who had been cut off when supply routes collapsed, who learned to keep the reactors running without sanctioned tech priests, who repurposed mining charges into weapons and rationed air with an efficiency that bordered on genius. They had survived. We landed in the central shaft complex, a cathedral of steel, descending kilometers into the moon's core. Gravity was inconsistent, flickering as systems failed and were rerouted by hands that should not have known how. Vox traffic was a constant chorus of overlapping commands, prayers and screams, as the enemy used the terrain with an intimacy no invading force could match. They came at us from maintenance tunnels no auspex had mapped. They collapsed sections behind us, not to trap us, but to isolate us. They did not charge screaming. They waited. They listened. They learned. This was not heresy born of devotion to dark gods. This was heresy born of competence. My squad died in stages, not all at once, not gloriously. One lost to decompression when a bulkhead was vented with surgical precision. Another crushed under a lift sabotaged to fail just as his weight shifted. A third taken down by a weapon that should not have been able to penetrate power armor, but did, because it was placed exactly where armor joints met and doctrine assumed safety. I adapted. That is what I do. I rerouted power. I sealed breaches manually. I used my dead brothers as cover, their armor still warm, their machine spirits screaming through the link. I killed anyone who moved too efficiently to be merely panicked. Hours passed, then days. Time dissolved into a series of threats neutralized and systems barely kept online. When relief finally came, it was not to extract us. It was to bombard the shaft from orbit, collapsing the moon's interior into itself. I escaped because a grav lift malfunctioned and flung me clear moments before impact. The official report listed the operation as a strategic success. Enemy infrastructure denied. Delay achieved. Acceptable losses sustained. I was commended. Privately, my survival was noted again. The pattern repeated across campaigns. Everywhere I was sent, the enemy was not chaos in its theatrical excess, but humanity that had learned how to live without the Imperium's hand on its throat. Void stations whose crews recycled air beyond sanctioned limits. Frontier worlds that developed crop strains without Mechanicus approval. Hive sectors that quietly reorganized distribution networks after administrative neglect. Survival created innovation. Innovation created deviation. Deviation required eradication. Each time, I was deployed as a corrective measure, a reminder that adaptation without permission is a sin punishable by extinction, and each time, the lesson was reinforced again. I found myself facing people who looked at me not with hatred, but with something closer to disappointment, as if I represented not an enemy, but a future they might have had they chosen differently. Those looks stayed with me longer than wounds. I began to realize that the Imperium does not actually want its citizens to survive hardship. It wants them to endure just enough to remain useful, just enough to keep the machine running. Anything beyond that is dangerous. A man who learns he can live through hell may start to wonder what else he can live without. That thought is lethal. The suspicion surrounding me deepened. I can feel it in the way briefings were delivered, in the way chaplains' gazes lingered a fraction too long, in the subtle recalibration of my armor's monitoring systems. My vitals were watched, my reaction times scrutinized. My dreams, when they occurred, were recorded and reviewed for doctrinal irregularities. They found none. That too was a problem. Faith to the Imperium is not about purity, it is about predictability. A faithful servant should break at the correct moment, should die when the calculus demands it, should not continue functioning indefinitely like a machine that refuses to wear down. I was becoming anomalous. I understood then that my greatest sin was not doubt or mercy or hesitation. It was consistency. I survived without becoming unstable, without turning traitor, without burning out. I remained efficient, reliable, whole. There is no place for that kind of persistence. I started to see the shape of my future, not as a reward, but as an assignment. One last deployment. One last mission where survival would be statistically impossible. Even for me, a ledger correction disguised as honor. When the order finally came, it was wrapped in reverence. A relic world, a lost crusade, a chance to strike at the heart of a threat deemed too entrenched for conventional forces. I read the briefing once. That was enough. They were not sending me to win. They were sending me to stop existing. And for the first time since the Manufactorum world burned, since I learned that breathing could be treason, I felt something dangerously close to clarity. Because I understood, with absolute precision, what was being asked of me. Not to die, but to finally stop surviving. The irony was almost elegant. They framed the mission as culmination, as destiny fulfilled, as if all the wars, all the improbable survivals, all the bodies stacked behind me had been leading to this singular moment of meaning. They spoke of sacrifice with the careful reverence reserved for relics too fragile to handle directly. They said my name often, louder than necessary, as though repetition could convince me it still belonged to me. I listened, I accepted, I knelt when required. I spoke the oaths with perfect cadence. Inside, something adjusted. The relic world lay beyond stable routes, a dead sphere drifting through a region where the warp thinned and thickened unpredictably, like a wounded organ struggling to heal. Long-range augurs showed ruins predating Imperial records, structures too vast and too deliberate to have been built by desperation alone. Whatever had lived there once had not merely survived, It had planned to. The threat assessment was vague by design. Insurrection, contagion of ideology, persistent survival outside Imperial doctrine, forming a shape that justified annihilation without revealing its face. I was deployed alone. Not officially, of course. Officially, I led an honor guard, a vanguard force chosen for purity and resilience. Unofficially, our insertion vectors ensured dispersion. Atmospheric turbulence scattered the drop pods across continents. Vox interference delayed coordination. By the time I made planetfall, I was already alone. The surface was silent in a way that felt intentional. No fires, no broadcasts, no frantic movement. The air was breathable, untainted by industrial runoff or mass decay. That alone was enough to make the world guilty. I moved through ruins that had not been shattered by war, but abandoned with care. Tools stored, pathways cleared, symbols etched not as warnings, but as records. This was not a civilization that had collapsed. It had withdrawn. They watched me long before I saw them. The first sign was absence. No ambush, no traps, no attempt to slow me. They let me walk, let me observe, let me draw conclusions that unsettled me more deeply than violence ever could. My armor logged environmental data that contradicted everything the briefing had promised. Energy signatures consistent with sustainable power grids. Agricultural terraces grown wild but not dead. Water systems still cycling beneath the stone. This world was alive. It simply did not want the Imperium. When they finally revealed themselves, it was without fear. A delegation of unarmed figures stepped into the open plaza of a city whose scale dwarfed anything I had seen outside hive capitals. They wore layered garments reinforced with materials my armor struggled to classify. Their faces were calm, scarred, old. They did not kneel. The one who spoke addressed me not as warrior, not as angel, not as executioner, but as survivor. He used the word carefully, as if it were something precious. "We know what you are," he said, "not what you wear, what you endured." My weapon remained trained on him. My armor urged compliance. Eliminate leadership, disrupt cohesion, begin cleansing. I did none of those things. He spoke of a history that had never been recorded, of ancestors who had learned, early on, that waiting for rescue was a death sentence. Of worlds forgotten not out of malice, but neglect. Of people who discovered that survival, when shared, could become something other than a crime. They had hidden not because they were weak, but because they understood the Imperium better than its own citizens did. To be seen, he said, is to be counted. To be counted is to be corrected. The words struck with a familiarity that felt like an old wound reopening. They did not ask me to defect. They did not offer sanctuary. They did not promise absolution. They simply told me the truth they had learned at great cost, that the Imperium could not tolerate proof that humanity could persist without it. Not forever, not even briefly. My orders were clear. Total eradication, orbital fire once confirmation of threat persistence was received. All I had to do was transmit. I did not. For the first time, survival was not instinct or accident. It was choice. I severed my long-range Vox. I falsified telemetry. I walked with them through their cities and saw what happens when fear is not used as mortar. I saw children taught not obedience, but caution. I saw elders revered not for titles, but for memory. I saw a future the Imperium would burn on principle. They knew I could not stay. "You are too visible," the speaker told me. "Your survival has weight. It bends probability around you." He was right. Imperial forces would come regardless. They always do. My presence alone had likely already sealed this world's fate. Survival leaves tracks, and the Imperium is very good at following them. When the fleet arrived, I did what I had been trained to do. I became the problem. I reactivated my Vox and transmitted coordinates, altered just enough. I sabotaged defense arrays in ways that appeared accidental. I led strike teams into kill zones and ensured no one lived long enough to report accurately. I survived, again and again, in ways that drew attention, scrutiny, confusion. The fleet hesitated. Conflicting reports stalled bombardment. Doubt crept into the margins of command. Time passed. Time was all the world needed. Evacuation protocols long prepared were enacted. populations dispersed into void-hardened vessels masked against auger sweeps. By the time the first shells fell, they struck stone and memory, not people. The Imperium declared the operation a failure due to unpredictable anomalies. Responsibility was assigned upward, then downward, until it landed where it always does, on me. I was extracted under guard. Decommissioning was discussed, reassignment considered, execution postponed pending further analysis. I survived that too. Now I am housed in a place with no windows and walls that hum with constant surveillance. They are deciding what to do with me, whether my continued existence is still useful, or whether the ledger finally demands balance. I sit in my armor and wake, not with fear, but with understanding, because I know something now that the Imperium does not want its servants to realize. Survival is not a crime because it defies death. It is a crime because it proves the Emperor is not required for humanity to continue, and that truth once lived cannot be unlearned. I am still alive, and somewhere out there so are they. That will have to be enough. They have not spoken to me in 312 hours. I know the number because the armor counts when nothing else is permitted to change. Light cycles mean nothing here. There is no sunrise, no shadow, no reminder that time ever moved differently. Only the low, constant thrum of containment fields and the distant vibration of machinery that exists solely to ensure I do not. This is not imprisonment. That would imply guilt has already been confirmed. This is evaluation, the Imperium's favorite purgatory, a place where survival is suspended, dissected and weighed for usefulness. I have been here before in other forms, holding cells beneath hive precincts, transit barges packed with men who had lived too long to be comfortable, inquisitorial antechambers where confession is expected before the question is asked. The architecture is always different. The intention never is. They want to know why I lived, not in the abstract, not philosophically. They want a mechanical explanation, a flaw in probability, a mutation of temperament, a statistical anomaly that can be isolated, replicated, or removed. They will not accept the truth, because the truth has no component they can replace. The truth is that I learned how the Imperium kills survivors and stepped sideways when the blow fell. That lesson did not come from doctrine. It came from rubble and smoke and the sound a body makes when it hits stone after being told to kneel. When the interrogation finally begins, it does so without ceremony, no dramatic entrance, no threats, just a presence on the other side of the field, obscured by refracted light and authority. Tired in the way only those who wield absolute power can afford to be. You deviate, it says. Not a question. I endure, I reply. The armor records my tone as neutral, acceptable. A pause, data scrolling, lives reduced to lines and timestamps. Endurance beyond projected parameters, the voice corrects, repeatedly. I do not answer, there is nothing to add. They ask about the relic world, about altered telemetry, about inconsistencies in after-action reports that no longer exist except as corrupted fragments. They ask why bombardment was delayed, why extraction windows were missed, why I alone returned intact. I tell them what they already know, that the enemy was destroyed, that the mission failed due to environmental interference, that I acted within my understanding of my orders. Each statement is true enough to pass machine verification. Lies are unnecessary when reality itself is pliable. They are not satisfied. They never are. What do you believe? The voice asks eventually. This is the real test. Belief is harder to quantify, harder to erase. I believe survival is costly, I say, and that someone must always pay. Another pause, longer this time. And who, the voice asks, do you believe should bear that cost? There it is. The question beneath all questions. The Imperium's answer is simple. The weak, the slow, the unproductive. Those who fail to die on schedule. Those who adapt incorrectly. Those who survive without permission. My answer is different. The one who benefits most from it, I say. Silence follows. Heavy. Considered. They do not execute me. That is how I know I has become dangerous. Execution would be neat, clean, a closed account. Instead, they do what the Imperium always does when faced with something it cannot openly destroy. They reassign it. I am declared penitent. Not condemned, not absolved, redirected. Sent to a place where survival is not merely unlikely, but structurally opposed. A war so protracted, so ruinous that even memory struggles to persist there. They tell me this is mercy. They tell me this is a chance to redeem statistical excess with appropriate loss. They tell me nothing survives where I am going. They have said that before. As the transport carries me toward another horizon of fire, I think of the worlds that burn because people learned how to live without oversight. I think of the child with the hollowed book, of the moon that collapsed inward, of the relic world that emptied itself rather than be counted. I think of how many times I was supposed to die, and how many times I chose not to. The Imperium will eventually succeed. I am not arrogant enough to believe otherwise. No one survives forever. Even legends are ground down into instruction manuals and cautionary footnotes. But survival does not need to be eternal to matter. It only needs to last long enough to prove a point. That living is not obedience. That endurance is not loyalty. That sometimes the most heretical act a man can commit is to keep breathing after the universe has decided he should not. I am still alive, and somewhere because of that, others are too. If that makes me a criminal, then the sentence has already been served, in full. They think this is where it ends, not because the war ahead is vast, or because the enemy is merciless, or because the attrition rates are so severe that even the administratum hesitates to attach names to the dead. They think it ends here, because this war is designed to consume time itself, to stretch suffering so thin and so long that survival loses coherence, that men stop thinking in terms of before and after, and exist only as functions of the present moment's violence. They believe this will simplify me. The transport shudders as it tears free of the warp. Alarms chiming in ritualized patterns that once would have set my pulse racing. Now they are just sound, data without meaning. We disembark into a sky permanently stained by chemical exhaust and ionized dust. The horizon is a jagged line of wreckage and fortifications layered atop one another, like the sediment of a civilization that never learned when to stop dying. This war has no name anyone remembers correctly. It has been fought for so long that the original cause has dissolved into inherited hatred and automated responses. Units rotate in, units vanish, the front lines shift a few meters each year, and then slide back again. Victory is not expected. Termination is. This is where they send survivors. I am folded into a formation that does not ask questions. No one here looks closely at anyone else. That would require energy better spent staying upright. We fight for days, then weeks, then intervals that no longer align with any calendar I have ever known. Sleep comes in fragments measured in minutes stolen between bombardments. Food is a variable, water a rumor. Men die constantly, quietly, often without witnesses. I do not. I should clarify that. I am wounded, repeatedly. Systems fail, armor plates shear away, internal organs rupture, and are sealed again by mechanisms designed for longevity rather than comfort. Pain is present, but distant, as if happening to someone I once knew. Each time I fall, I get back up, not because I want to. Want is a luxury that burned away long ago. I get back up because I understand something the Imperium refuses to articulate openly. This war is not meant to be won. It is meant to erase those who have become inconvenient to kill elsewhere. I begin to notice patterns again. Officers reassigned shortly after demonstrating initiative. Veterans rotated to the most exposed sectors. Units with unusually high survival rates deployed to objectives that do not exist. The same accounting logic I have seen all my life, just stretched across decades instead of days. Survival, prolonged and uncorrected, attracts attention even here. They try different methods. They assign me to lead charges through fields already ranged by enemy artillery. I make it through. They embed me with units known for collapsing under pressure. I stabilize them long enough for evacuation. They send me into zones saturated with toxins that degrade even Astartes' physiology. The armor adapts. I adapt with it. Each time the reports mark me as operationally resilient. Each time that phrase feels less like praise and more like a diagnosis. I begin to hear whispers, not of corruption or heresy, but of luck. Men touch my armor for a fraction too long before battle. They stay closer to me than doctrine advises. I see the relief in their eyes when I am assigned to their sector. Hope is dangerous, I distance myself. I have seen what happens to those who gather followers without intending to. The Imperium has a word for that too, though it rarely says it aloud. Precedent. Still, even distance cannot fully erase the effect. Where I go, more people come back than expected. Not many, not enough to be miraculous, just enough to be noticed by those who still bother to count. The enemy changes tactics, not because of me, but because war always does. New weapons, new horrors, things that wear human shapes but do not move like anything born. Things that survive injuries that should end them. I fight them, and I survive that too. At some point the war stops feeling external, a tension between the inevitability promised by doctrine and the stubborn reality of my continued existence. I am no longer trying to live. I am trying to understand why I am allowed to. That question follows me into a breach one cycle later, when the sky opens and something ancient and screaming spills into the trenches. The kind of thing the Imperium pretends is rare, but prepares for obsessively. The kind of thing that should erase everyone present. It does not. The battle is incoherent, a blur of sound and motion and impossible geometry. Men die without leaving bodies. Reality tears and stitches itself back together incorrectly. I fight until my armor is a ruin and my blade is little more than a broken edge. When it ends, I am kneeling in a crater filled with cooling glass, alive, again. They extract me days later, quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. There are no commendations this time. No reassignment orders delivered with solemn pride. There is just a summons. I am taken somewhere deeper, older, a place where the Imperium keeps things it has not yet decided how to categorize. The walls are thicker. The air tastes filtered in a way that suggests secrets, not sanitation. They ask me fewer questions now. They already know the answers. What they want is to see if I know them too. "You persist," one of them says, finally. No accusation, just observation. "Yes," I reply. "Do you know why?" I consider lying. It would be easier, cleaner, safer. But survival has taught me that some truths only become dangerous once spoken, and others become lethal if they are not. "Because I stopped waiting for permission," I say. That is when I understand that this conversation was never about my past. It is about what comes next. Because in an Imperium that survives by making survival a crime, a man who understands that rule is not a liability. He is a threat. And for the first time since the Manufactorum world burned, I realize something else with terrible clarity. They are not trying to kill me anymore. They are trying to decide how to use what I have become.